Hey guys, how's everybody doing? My name is Todd Kuhns. Welcome back to the channel. If you've never been here before, welcome to the channel. I appreciate you guys coming and watching, and hopefully you enjoy the video today. Before I start today, I want to be very clear. I've said this before. I am not a review channel. I have no desire to get the latest, greatest cameras, review them. It's just not my thing. However, I am very willing to talk about the gear that I use and kind of review the things that I use and talk about why I use it, what I like about it, what I don't like about it. And today I'm going to talk about the Fuji X-T4. I've had the camera for about 6 months, 7 months. I got it last summer. I feel that that's kind of a good amount of time to have put it through the paces and know what I'm talking about. Now, before I dive into it too much, I want to do a little bit of a backstory. I've done this before. If you've watched the channel, maybe this is kind of review for you. But if you don't know who I am, I think it's only fair for me to kind of lay that out so that I'm not just some schmuck on YouTube thinking he knows what he's talking about. I want to put a little bit of credibility to what I'm saying and why it even matters. So let me just kind of give you the quick short story. I'm a commercial photographer. I've been doing it for about 30 years. I have a degree in commercial photography. Obviously I started in the film days, shooting all types of formats of cameras. You know, my career went in a lot of different directions. I did product work, I did fashion work, I freelance assisted for a long time. I ended up shooting weddings for a very long time, about 7 years I should say. I did, you know, it was about 90% of my business during those years. Continued to do other freelance stuff during that time, and then I ended up going back to the school that I went to, and I taught college level photography and Photoshop for 7 years. Continued to freelance during that entire time, and then for the last about 13 years I moved to South Carolina, and I have been a catalog photographer where I shoot product and fashion, well, not really fashion, but model product advertising for a company here in town. During that time, I continue to freelance. I do a lot of stock photography, events, still do occasionally a wedding here or there, certainly a lot of portraits, and, you know, any kind of projects I can get my hands on. I love to do travel photography, so I've done a lot of different things, and that's kind of where I'm plugging the X-T4 into that workflow. And so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense as to how I'm reviewing it and what I'm going to talk about. I should also make a point to tell you that when I switched into the Fuji line, I left Canon full frame cameras, and I've done videos about why I did that and, you know, the decision behind that. But just so you know, I came from the Canon world over to the Fuji world. One of the things that I love about this camera, and one of the reasons why I switched, was because I was using the Canon 5D, the original Mark I, if you will, the classic 5D. It was a great camera. I did a lot of professional work with it. No complaints. It was just, I mean, for what I used it for, it was a fantastic camera. And I know it was outdated. A lot of what it was outdated for me needing to make a change was that it didn't do video, because now that I have the channel and I'm starting to do a little bit of video work here or there, I needed a camera to do video. Switching over to the latest greatest Canon was a money issue. So that's why I went to the Fuji. And I don't claim to be a expert on video. I really don't want to dive into being an expert or coming across as an expert on video, but the X-T4 does amazing video in my mind, especially for what I do with it. And because of that, I'm going to switch over to do the rest of this video on the X-T4. So I'm going to switch over now. Okay, so I know that there's a group of people out there that heard me just say I switched from Canon full frame to the Fuji X-T4. And if you know anything about the X-T4, you'll know that it's not a full frame sensor, it's an APS-C size sensor, which means it's smaller. And everybody knows that in photography, bigger usually means better. So why would I switch to a smaller sensor? And I would have liked to have stuck with a full frame sensor. However, price became a big part of it, and the way that I guess I justified the whole thing was, does the X-T4 meet the needs of what I do? I wasn't trying to compromise, I wasn't trying to downsize, you know, like I said, price was a factor, but does this camera meet my needs? And the best example I can think of is if you have a screwdriver, just a manual screwdriver, versus like a power drill. They both do the job, but do you need the power tools to do the job when sometimes just the screwdriver is good enough? And I don't know if that's the perfect analogy, but for me, the X-T4 did an amazing job. The quality was there. A lot of other things about the camera I really liked. And again, I come back to the price part of it, that it was worth going to a smaller sensor, even though full frame would have brought in some benefits. For what I do for a living, the 26 megapixel smaller sensor met my needs. I'm not a big shooter under low light. It's not something I do a lot. I know bigger sensors are better for low light. I'm not doing work that needs to be blown up to gigantic proportions, so the smaller sensor was okay. And even though it was a compromise, I think the other things about the camera more than made up for it. Now, when it comes to switching to a smaller sensor, I've heard a lot of photographers on YouTube talk about how they were tired of lugging around the big full frame camera and all the big heavy lenses that come with this. Trust me when I say the size of the camera had nothing to do with my decision. This camera is a little bit smaller probably than my Canon was. The lenses a little bit smaller, not much, but size was not an issue. I believe in bringing the right tool to the job. Even if you got to hike 10 miles, you take that big camera if that's the one that does the job best. So the size of the camera being smaller was not a factor whatsoever. I'll talk about the vertical grip. I put the vertical grip on it. It's really not that much smaller of a camera, so not an issue. However, if you want to talk about size and being smaller, this camera takes an SD card as opposed to a compact flash card, which is what I'd always used in the past. SD cards, I'm sure, and I'm not a technical wizard, I'm sure that there's a reason why they're better. Nobody seems to use compact flash cards anymore, but they're so tiny. I got used to it and I deal with it, and it is what it is. But coming from the film world where you had these big medium format rolls of film, and now you got this little tiny SD card, I'm always afraid I'm going to drop it, break it, something. I don't know. I'm trying to get used to the smaller cards, and I'm getting there, but for whatever reason, they're just so small. I don't know. I need something with a little more bulk, I guess. But yeah, it is what it is. I got to get used to it. The other big switch going from Canon DSLRs to this camera was that I was switching from a DSLR to a mirrorless camera. Now the whole world seems to be going mirrorless, and before I bought this camera, I really didn't understand why it was so important. I'm not quite sure I still understand why it was so important, but it was definitely something that I had to get used to because you no longer are looking through the lens. So hopefully this will make a little bit of sense. When you have a DSLR camera and you look through the viewfinder, you are literally looking through the lens to whatever you're taking a photograph of. The light's coming through the lens, going through a mirror, bouncing through the prism, and coming to your eye. With a mirrorless camera, however, the light's coming into the lens and it's being projected onto an LCD screen, which is that viewfinder. I mean, what you see on the screen on the back is basically the same thing in the viewfinder when you're looking through it, which if you're outside on a bright sunny day, you can see I'm underexposed, I'm overexposed, or whatever, and you can change your dials to get that image looking exactly the way you want it. The drawback to it, and one of the things that affects me quite a bit, because I do a lot of flash photography. A lot of what I do deals with flash, and I'm not doing ambient light so much. So if you're seeing through the viewfinder what is actually in front of you, it may be very dark. Like for instance, a wedding reception is a good example. The light is very low, and you're relying on that flash to go off to give you the good exposure. Well, you're not seeing that through the camera when the flash isn't going off, if that makes sense. So there's a workaround for that, and you can turn the preview off. And I'm not sure exactly what the camera does, but it brightens up the viewfinder so you can see what you're doing in a dark room, knowing that the flash is going to go off. It's not a big deal, but it's something that's a little bit different. You've got to know to turn that on and off. And the one thing that I found, because I have shot with this camera at weddings, I've been at a wedding that is an outdoor wedding, but yet there's indoor activity, like, the bride and the girls are getting ready or whatever, and you're going inside, outside, and you're going back and forth. And if that room that they're getting ready in is dark enough, you're not going to be able to see through the camera, and you're constantly switching that mode back and forth, because when you go back outside, you kind of want that exposure preview back on, because it's kind of nice to know, the exposure's correct outside. Outside of that little preview button that you're going to have to go into the menu and change when you're in a dark room versus, a bright ambient situation, I haven't found any problems with the mirrorless. It's very fast. The focus is amazing. the focus on this camera seems to be right on the money. It's got in-body stabilization, which I don't know if it just focuses so much better than my Canons, or there's something about the IBIS that kind of is assisting me as well. It might be a little bit of both, but what I have found with this camera is 99% of the things that I have photographed have been tack sharp, right on. And if I ever miss the focus, it's not because it didn't focus, it just focused on the wrong thing, maybe something behind it. Where my Canon, I used to always kind of, if I focused on somebody's eye, it might just hit their ear. It was always just a little bit off, and I ended up doing a lot of manual focus with my Canon rather than rely on the autofocus because it wasn't always as right on the money. This camera happens to be right on the money, or at least what I've seen so far. Now, I've said this before when I reviewed the X100V, which I absolutely love that camera as well. I said the same things I'm going to say about this camera, and that is the old school dials that Fuji has put on the top of the camera. I absolutely love that. I love being able to make my adjustments, shutter speed, aperture, ISO. It's all right there on the camera without having to go into a menu. That to me is one of the greatest parts about this camera. I know I've heard a few people on YouTube talk about how they don't care for that. I'm not sure if it's just because I grew up shooting film and so it's natural to me, but there's something about being able to look at it, make your adjustments without having to go, flip through a menu and find it. It's just easy. It's just one of the best parts about this camera. And if you are a new photographer, I think it's a much better way to learn when the aperture dial is right there on the lens and the shutter speed is right in front of you. It's a great camera to learn on. But even as a seasoned professional, I just like all those dials and all those controls right at my fingertips. Speaking of the dials, the ISO dial is right there on the left. Let me tell you one little quick thing about it, and the shutter speed dial has this as well. But when I was at a wedding, I noticed that the ISO dial is on the left-hand side. It's kind of a big wheel and turns really easy. It's real easy to manage. But somewhere along the line in my wedding, I had bumped it. And something slid across it and turned it. It wasn't a huge deal. I caught it at some point, but it had changed on me. Initially, I thought, well, they kind of engineered this dial a little too easily to be bumped. However, there is a button right on top. Push that down, locks it into place, problem solved. And speaking of ISO, what I do with this camera is I usually have it on auto ISO, depending on the job. I shouldn't say that. A lot of times I'll put it on auto ISO. Sometimes I'll set it the way I just need to set it. But I am more than comfortable to go up to 3200. No real issues with the noise at that point. I haven't really pushed it beyond that, not because I'm not willing to push it higher than that, just because my type of work, I don't really need to go higher than that. And I don't even need to go that high very often. But with the Canons, and I know I had an older Canon, I didn't go much over 400, maybe 800 before I started having a lot of problems. So with this camera, the noise factor, not an issue. The only problem is that I have to get out of my comfort zone and be willing to shoot at that. And the longer I shoot with this camera, the more I'm willing to go to those high ISOs and still get the quality that I need. So for me, that's an A+. I know a lot of people might be, you came into photography just last year and you've always shot at 3200. I don't know. For me, coming from the film days, we didn't go much over 400 and we typically stayed at 50 or 100. So the digital age has kind of pushed me to know I can do that. But this camera is kind of solving any issues I had in my own mind that I needed to stay at low ISOs, because this camera does quite well at the high ISOs. Now, I talked about focus, how fast this camera is. It is just lightning fast. Don't argue with me if you know of I'm not a sports guy, so if you know of other ones that do faster, I don't doubt they're out there. But this camera focuses very fast. It's very accurate. I will say the one lens that I have for it, I have the 16 to 80, which is a fantastic lens. It's an f4 lens. I don't need f1 point whatever. Again, that's not my style of shooting. f4 is fine. A lot of times when I'm shooting portraits, I may be at f8, certainly 5.6, something like that. So an f4 lens is certainly fast enough for me. I've loved this lens, and I'm not really reviewing this lens, but that's the one lens so far that I have for the camera. But one thing I want to say, and this is not a knock on Fuji by any means, but it focuses the opposite direction that my Canon's focused, and zooms in and out the opposite directions from my Canon. And I wouldn't have thought that would have been a big deal. However, I guess I did not realize how used to zooming in and out and focusing a certain way, how accustomed I was to that. And when I switched, I find myself going the wrong way all the time. And that's been a little bit of an adjustment. And I still go the wrong way. I try to, go to a wider focal length and I'm zooming in. And so I catch myself and go the other way. So, that's just a matter of using it enough to where you get used to it. And I don't know. Not a knock by any means. Just when you switch from one to the other, it's a little bit of an adjustment. Like I said before, I put the vertical grip on the camera. I did it for a couple of reasons. Number one of the concerns I had with this camera was battery life. I knew that if I was going to shoot a wedding or an event or something where I was going to be shooting a large number of images over the course of a day, I didn't want to always be constantly changing batteries or concerned that the battery was going to run out at the wrong time. So I got the vertical grip knowing that I could put 2 extra batteries in there. This camera actually, you keep the battery that's up in the body as well as the 2 in the vertical grip, so you've got 3 batteries. I've shot a couple of weddings with this camera and it hasn't even come close to running out. I think maybe 1 battery got depleted, the other 2 were still full or very close to full. No issues whatsoever. So that solves the battery issue to where I'm not even having to think about it, even at a large event. But the other thing that I put it on there was, and maybe this is me being shallow, and maybe coming from the old school days when, walking in with a big, huge Hasselblad camera was impressive and everybody thought, oh, he must know what he's talking about. Having a little bit bigger camera with the vertical grip on there, to me, for whatever reason, I'm thinking clients are going to be like, okay, look at this guy's got this huge camera, you must know what he's talking about. Now, I still think there's truth to that, but I also think the world's changing a little bit. I've done a wedding with my X100V. It's a little tiny camera. It's only yay big. And people have come up and like, wow, what a great camera that is. So maybe things are changing and that image of, a large camera being impressive, maybe I'm kidding myself on that. But between the battery life and, having a little bigger, impressive camera, looking like a professional rather than this little tiny thing, those were the reasons why I put the vertical grip on there. Now I know that I'm not diving into all the specs of the camera and giving it a review like that. It's a 26 megapixel camera, which for what I do is plenty big enough. I realize there are cameras out there that do 100 megapixels and so on and so forth. Let me say this too. I meant to say this at the beginning. One of the things, switching from full frame to a smaller camera and any knocks against Fuji is because they don't make a full frame camera. I really believe the thinking that maybe Fuji has, they don't need a full frame camera because they're making medium format cameras that are as simple to use as one of these cameras. And the prices are starting to come down where they're a little bit more affordable. And I think at some point, the full frame Canons and Nikons are going to be in direct competitions to the medium format Fujis. Now I could be wrong about that, but I'm kind of thinking that's where Fuji is going with this and why they're not doing a full frame. So knowing that if you ever needed to get to a bigger system, all my lighting that I have acquired to go with this Fuji camera will work with the medium format. But that's just a thought that I have about Fuji's kind of direction and where they're going and why they don't have a full frame camera. So again, my review really isn't about all the technical specs and numbers and specifics of the camera. It's more about what the camera is as far as the way I use it, how it meets the needs of what I do. And really what I have found, it's kind of like having a sports car. Like I've got this fancy decked out Ferrari that does all these things, although I'm just going to drive to the grocery store. Not that the work that I do is boring. We do some exciting things, but I don't necessarily feel like I use all the things that this camera will do, but they're at my disposal if I need to do them. So I can get into some bigger jobs and I can do some different things knowing this camera will meet those needs. As far as the technical side of it, as far as quality of the images that are coming out of it, amazing. And I don't really think it's about the size, the megapixels or the size of the sensor. If it's well lit, well exposed, it's going to be a phenomenal image. When I started my digital career, I was using a 3 megapixel Canon, and it was a smaller sensor as well. And I shot professionally with it. You couldn't get that camera off of 100 ISO without getting a bunch of noise in it. But if you stayed at 100 ISO, and like I said, lit things correctly, exposed things correctly, it was beautiful. So this camera, as long as I'm doing my technical side of things correctly, produces some amazing images. It's a lot of fun to use. Just like my X100V with all the old school dials and stuff, there's something about it that makes you want to get out and do photography and, you know, get excited about it. And I hadn't had that for a long time. So that in itself was worth the switch. Now the last thing I want to do is I'll show you a few images that I've taken with this camera, although, you know, I don't think a camera review is necessarily all about the pictures that it takes. Like I said, if you expose things correctly and you light things correctly, any camera is going to do really good work for you. You know, you could have the greatest camera in the world, $30,000 camera, and take lousy pictures with it. But I'll show a few pictures that I've done as I'm kind of ending here. Just to kind of give you a little bit about what I do. If you have any questions whatsoever, please let me know. Thanks for watching. If you could give me a thumbs up, I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed, now would be a great time to subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that as well. For all of you who have subscribed lately and got me over the 600 mark, we're well on our way to that 1,000 this year, and 2022 is turning out pretty good so far. I hope you're having a good year, and thanks for the comments, guys, and I will see you in the next video.